Hello everyone, this is Lala and today I'm going to talk about what is brown and brownness. So there has been a lot of discussion about what brown is, who is brown, and because I mainly cover reality TV, especially Big Brother, this question has come up a lot. With CBS shows, meaning Survivor and The Amazing Race, having diversity quotas, and other reality shows that I watch, like The Challenge, also having diversity quotas, it is an ever-growing process. Due to this, there is often discussion about who is cast as a quote-unquote white person and who is cast as a quote-unquote person of color. And many of the person of color that some people would confuse or identify as white are technically called brown under certain identities, and there's so much overlap and it's just very confusing. There was a discussion on Big Brother 25 regarding who is considered brown or white by house guests Hisham and America that brought this more to my attention.
I don't know if maybe it's a cultural thing.
Yeah.
Like she's white and I'm white too. Like my race is white, but I'm Mexican background.
Right.
So it's a little bit different to connect in that sense.
Yeah.
And it's important.
It's important, right? It's important,
Yeah.
right? Like one of the things that I always talk about is like I don't like to see brown on brown crime,
Yeah.
right? And I have think
There is so much to unpack just with that little clip, especially with a Mexican woman who could be a mestiza or a castiza, identifying as white and whether that's accurate or not, and an Egyptian man who can very much pass for white, not feeling connected to white, but due to his age being closer to 9/11, he has a different lived experience. And with Hispanic people and Middle Eastern North African people finally being claimed as not white according to the upcoming 2025 census, where they now have their own ethnic/racial categories, this brought the concept of brownness more to the forefront in my mind and in reality. So, in order to discuss the bigger issues pertaining the quote-unquote brown identity, the historical element of the term/identity needs to be delved into, and who is identified as quote-unquote brown needs to be defined, which is an entire cluster in itself. During the 17th and 18th centuries, a lot of anthropologists, writers, and other people involved in literature created the concept of race and decided to use quote-unquote scientific reasons to determine the differences between the races. These races were divided into colors, and one of them was brown. German physician Johann Friedrich Blumenbach wrote a doctoral dissertation translated in English to On the Natural Varieties of Mankind, where he created 5 human races based on skin color, geography, and skull measurements. Caucasians, which is white, Ethiopians, which is black, Americans, which is red, Mongolians, which is yellow, and the 5th one was called the Malay race, which is brown. This group was mainly referred to people from islander Southeast Asia, Australasia, and even Madagascar, where it was believed that brown people were a transition between white and black people, while who this term refers to changes over the centuries. This blend between black and white, or a distinction that is used as a rationale for this quote-unquote race or group in the present day. Many geologists and other scholars defined and created their own interpretations and variations of who belongs to this brown group. In the 19th century, the 5-race scheme included Ethiopians and Egyptians in the brown race and Oceanic people as well by John Baptiste Julian Domalius Dallery. In 1775, John Hunter of Edinburgh claimed that light brown people consisted of Southern Europeans like the Italian and Spanish, while the Persians, Turk, and Laplanders, which are Sami people, are also brown people. In 1915, Donald Mackenzie claimed that a Mediterranean or brown race, where the western part stretches to the British Isles and the eastern part stretches to India, while also including Egyptians as well. In 1920, eugenicist Lothrop Stoddard mapped out a quote-unquote brown race in The Rising Tide of Color Against the White World Supremacy, where the quote-unquote brown race consisted of North Africans, Horn of Africans, partially people of the Caucasus, the Near East, the Middle East, Central Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Australasia, where he saw the quote-unquote brown race as a part of the five races, where the others are white, black, yellow, and American. In the late 19th and early 20th century, Grafton Elliott Smith conceived the brown race as a natural extension to the Mediterranean race, basing this on Giuseppe Sergi's conception of the latter, where he claims that due to the close physical relationship between the populations from the Red Sea to India, which includes the Semites and Hamites, it makes sense why they are a bit separate but related to the Mediterraneans. So even Mediterraneans, like Southern Europeans, also have some claim to this brown term, especially from a historical context, though not really from a modern context. That's it for the background of the term. Of course, as the 20th and 21st century came to be, there has been more research where it is stated that there's no biological validation regarding race and has been dismissed scientifically. But there is still sociological significance, which does carry weight, as many people self-identify or people identify others as quote-unquote brown, using characteristics based on skin color, hair, culture, and language. Due to this, there are several people who call themselves or are called quote-unquote brown in society, but who is brown is different based on where the location is. Since I am from the Western world, and this term mainly refers to Western countries, I am mainly going to focus on who is identified as brown in countries of the Western world, though this term is mainly popular in Canada and the United States. In Canada, brown people, or the brown identity, is popularly used towards people of South Asian descent, and it's not referred to anyone else. I believe this is the case because South Asians are the largest racial minority pan-ethnic group and is the second largest pan-ethnic group overall in Canada after white Europeans. In the United States, the brown identity and who brown people are is very confusing and not really clear cut. It has been referenced in pop culture and American society to South Asian Americans, Middle Eastern Americans, Native Americans, Latino Americans, and to a lesser extent, Southern European Americans such as Italian Americans and Greek Americans. It has even been used to some extent towards Southeast Asian Americans, especially for Filipino Americans. Brown pride is an American movement, but it's mainly referred to Latinos, which is the second largest minority pan-ethnic group in the United States. So it tends to be more commonly used towards them, though it is still used towards others as well. And when it comes to stuff like the black and brown movement or ideology or whatever, the brown part is usually referred to Latino or Hispanic Americans, and the thing is, Hispanic and Latino Americans are a variety of races, since it is not a racial group, and there are people of every ethnic group essentially in Latinos and Hispanics, so it's just very confusing. So I typed brown person on TikTok to see what I would find, and I got this answer from AI Smart Search. So the term brown person is often used to describe individuals with a medium to dark skin tone, typically associated with people of South Asian, Middle Eastern, and Hispanic or African descent. The African part is interesting because I'm pretty sure they're referring to North African descent and not Sub-Saharan African descent, since black people generally are never called brown. However, it is important to note that the term can be subjective and its usage can vary depending on the context and region. Here are some of the key points to understand about the term brown person. 1. Diversity. The term brown person encompasses a wide range of ethnicities, cultures, and backgrounds. It is a way to acknowledge and celebrate the diversity within these communities. So, back to my opinion, this pretty much just seems like their way to say anyone who is not black, brown, or East or South East Asian who were called yellow in the past. So in my opinion, it's just saying anyone who is not in one of those three groups who were seen as the three main races a few centuries ago. Now back to the AI response. 2. Skin tone. The term is primarily used to describe individuals with a skin tone that falls within the brown spectrum. This can include various shades, from light brown to deep brown. 3. Geographical context. The term brown person is often used in Western countries to refer to individuals from regions where people generally have brown skin tones. So, like I mentioned earlier, it's mainly from a Western perspective. However, it is important to recognize that skin tones can vary within these regions as well. 4. Self-identification. Some individuals may choose to self-identify as brown as a way to embrace their cultural heritage and racial identity. It can be a source of pride and a way to connect with others who share similar experiences. So, back to my opinion now. I see this as people who were grouped into being white feel like it erases their ethnicity, their culture, and they don't feel like they belong there racially. So you see this a lot with especially Latinos and Middle Eastern North African people who have been categorized as white for over a century because the people in those groups from back in the day fought to be legally called white. But there's also the distinction of being legally white doesn't necessarily equate to the lived experience of white. So that is where the self-identification comes back. So, point number 5. Socio-political implications. The term brown person has gained significance in discussions surrounding race, identity, and social justice. It is often used to highlight the experiences and challenges faced by individuals who are marginalized or discriminated against based on their skin color. 6. Intersectionality. It is important to recognize that being a brown person is just one aspect of a person's identity. Individuals can have multiple intersecting identities, such as gender, religion, nationality, or socioeconomic status, which shapes their experiences and perspectives. And 7. Respect and sensitivity. When using the term brown person, it is crucial to do so with respect and sensitivity. It is always best to listen to individuals and communities to understand their preferred terminology and avoid generalizations or stereotypes. In summary, the term brown person is used to describe individuals with a medium to dark skin tone, often associated with specific ethnicities and regions. However, it is important to approach the term with respect, recognizing the diversity and complexity of individual experiences and identities. Now that I got all the definitions and history out of the way, it is time to bring this back into a reality TV context. And since my channel mainly covers Big Brother, I'm going to use that as an example. So above, you will see a collage of several of the seasons of Big Brother, and there will be 3 colors that represent each quote-unquote brown group. 1 is South Asian, 2 is Middle Eastern or Western Asian / North African, and the third one will be Hispanic / Latino. And just looking at them, you can see how they really aren't related to one another at all, and some of them blend in very well with their white counterparts, and this is because some of them are white. Or their genetics, especially with the Western Asian and North African, are so similar to some of their Italian counterparts and their Spaniard and Greek counterparts who are considered white, where they really fit in. So should Italians, Spaniards, Greeks, and other Southern Europeans, should they be considered brown? It just gets very confusing, and I think with the improvement of diversity due to the diversity quotas, there needs to be something more specific than just brown, which is really just an anonymous term that groups people with genetics and cultures and ethnicities that have absolutely nothing to do with one another. Obviously, I have gone into vast detail about these groups of people on Big Brother and their journeys, which you can all look above to get more further detail. But just from these pictures, you can clearly see that the earlier seasons there was absolutely no representation of anyone in the quote-unquote brown groups for like the first decade or so of the show's history, and when we did have representation, they were often Hispanic. And the Hispanic Latinos are all under different races as well, but the ones we see earlier on are mainly white Latinos or mestizo. Latinos. And it isn't until more recent seasons where we start to see mulatto Latinos or Afro Latinos or even Asian Latinos. And even with just that group in general, there's just way too much diversity and way too many people in way too many different races that are in this group. And it's akin to grouping all Franco Americans of the Americas. So, like Haitians and the Quebecois people and all the other French territories to be one ethnic slash racial group. And the same thing with Anglo Americans, which includes white Canadians, white Americans, African Canadians, and all the Anglo Caribbean countries, and even South American countries, for that to be all a racial or an ethnic group. So it's just way too much going on there. And when it comes to diversity, you need to be a lot more specific. And then there are, of course, the Middle Eastern or Western Asian and North African contestants that have been sprinkled in here and there, though they've been more consistent on the recent seasons, where a lot of them blend in with their white counterparts because they are very genetically related to them, or they cast them that are very brown skinned, where due to the history of America, due to Islamophobia and 9/11, there is some controversy there as well. And then you have to think about multiraciality, where someone is half South Asian, half white, half Hispanic, though what race their Hispanic side is could be debated, and half white, or half North African and half white. So you have a lot of multiracial or multi-ethnic people being grouped into this brown group. And because we all know how multiraciality works in the minds of ignorant people, they tend to not talk about their white side as well. And I am planning a video about multiraciality in general being ignored on reality TV, so that's something I'm working on. Hopefully it'll be up soon. Now I really just want to look at these three groups of people to see how similar and different then they really are. Now it is time to talk about the genetic admixture of these groups of people, since it essentially makes them who they are. And of course I'm going to start with South Asians first. So, the AASI, which stands for Ancestral South Indians, were the first inhabitants of India and South Asia in general. The closest people to the AASI people currently are the orange people on the bottom right of the picture, where they are inhabitants of the Andaman Islands. But over time, ancient Neolithic Iranians started coming over and they migrated and merged with AASIs, which costs for the main genetic makeup of South Asians, especially Indians from India. The further south you go in India or even Sri Lanka, the more AASI ancestry there is. So southern India and Sri Lanka is generally about half and half, and this is kind of the case with Bangladesh as well, which is on the eastern end of South Asia. Then we have Western steppe herders, which came from Eastern Europe, who came over to Asia and they merged with these admixed ASI and Neolithic Iranian people. And you see here they are most present in the western area of South Asia, which is mainly Pakistan, which makes sense. And then, of course, on the other side of South Asia, you see the red, which is essentially East Asian admixture, and you see how they're mainly prevalent in Bhutan and Nepal and even northeast India, which, if you go over there, they look like East Asians, and even Bangladesh has a decent amount of AASI and East Asian admixture, so they're about half East Asian and half Neolithic Iranian. So that is essentially that admixture of South Asians overall, and when you look at a PCA plot, it is why South Asians are generally in the middle between Western Eurasians, which are Europeans and Middle Eastern North African people, and East and Southeast Asians, which some people called Mongoloids back in the day. So that's why they're roughly in the middle of that European to Asian linear line. Now, regarding the Middle Eastern or Western Asian and North African group, this is a very simplistic way of looking into their genetic admixture. So the pie charts are the more simplistic results regarding the four regions up top, which is the Middle East, Europe, East Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, while the boxes below them goes into further details in the hidden admixture, and I'm mainly going to be focusing on this. So you see with Northwest Africans, so that's essentially Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, they have a lot of ancient North African ancestry, which I believe is Ibero-Masan. Hopefully, I said that correctly. Admixture. So they have a lot of that, and you see a bit of the Arabian Peninsula admixture and a bit of the sub-Saharan African ancestry as well, though that would obviously be from West Africa. But the Ibero-Masurians, which is indigenous North African ancestry, in itself has a mixture of Western Eurasian and Western Sub-Saharan African admixture. So the original source of Northwest Africans are already admixed. So that explains the Moroccans, the Tunisians, and the Algerians. And of course, the southern you go in those areas, the more Sub-Saharan African you're going to get. Now, moving on to Northeast Africa, which consists of Libya and Egypt. And you can see from the chart here that the indigenous North African, the Ibero-Masan, hopefully I'm saying that correctly, ancestry is still present, but it's nowhere near as much as it is compared to Northwest Africa because that indigenous group was mainly in Northwest Africa in comparison. And what we also have with Northeast Africa is that you see a lot of Arabian ancestry, since obviously from the Arab slave trade and just migration in general from the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant moved over to Eastern North Africa because it's closest in proximity. So you have a lot of that ancestry coming from the Levant and the Peninsula as well. And then below, you still have the Sub-Saharan African ancestry, which comes from places like Sudan, Yemen, and the Horn of Africa, essentially, since there's a lot of admixture happening in all those areas. And the further south you go in Northeast Africa, the more Sub-Saharan African that there's going to be. So that is the genetic makeup of Libyans and Egyptians, mainly. So this is a very generalized look at the ancestry and the admixture of the Levant. So they still have a bit of that ancient North African admixture just due to proximity to North Africa being right next to them, but they mainly have their indigenous Levant and Arabian ancestry, which makes up a majority of their DNA, and due to their proximity to not only North Africa but Sub-Saharan Africa, they do have some Sub-Saharan African DNA in them, which is also partially due to the slave trade that happened as well. They do have a bit of Anatolian DNA just due to ancestry, and of course some Neolithic Iranian DNA in them as well, just due to that too. And of course, there's a lot of DNA from the Mediterranean just due to all of the travel that happens throughout the Mediterranean Sea and the close proximity to Greece, Italy, and the islands of those countries. So, yeah. For these remaining groups, I don't have a whole lot to say. So with the Arabian Peninsula, which includes countries like Kuwait, Oman, Yemen, and Saudi Arabia, they mainly have indigenous Arabian DNA, and that's what consists of most of their DNA, with bits of Levant, indigenous West African, and some Sub-Saharan African DNA, though that's mainly at the south of the area where they're by the Horn of Africa. So that's pretty much all there is to the DNA in the Arabian Peninsula. So with Turkey and Anatolia, pretty much a decent amount of their DNA comes from Europe via Greece and Southern Europe, and due to the travel between those areas, they have a decent amount of European DNA, and of course they have a lot of Neolithic Iranian DNA just due to being right beside Iran as well, and also having some Caucasus DNA from right above them. And of course there's a bit of Peninsula DNA, though that's mainly due to it being in proximity to Iraq, which is kind of in the middle of all these areas. And last but not least is Iran, where most of their DNA is obviously Neolithic Iranian, with some Anatolian DNA, but they do have some DNA from South Asia just due to proximity and travel. And obviously, that's by the areas in Iran that is close to Pakistan and Afghanistan. So they have some of that DNA from those areas. And when you look at a PCA plot, you would see that Middle Eastern and North African people, or I should say Western Asian people instead of Middle Eastern, generally are very closely related to Europeans, to the point where they are on their own end of the triangle with the Europeans, compared to East or Southeast Asians or Sub-Saharan African people, where even they're closer to European people, even over South Asian people who are in the middle between West Eurasian and East Eurasian, where Western Asian and North African people are considered Western Eurasian, and they're kind of lumped in with white people and European people, which is why they're considered Caucasian and white for centuries until things started changing. And I think things are changing due to the cultural element, due to their religion, not due to any genetic differences, outside of maybe North Africans. But even North Africans is a stretch, as they are closer to Europeans than even Horn of Africans and Sub-Saharan Africans. And last but not least is Latin America. And the thing with Latino slash Hispanic people is that there are so many different races within this group of people that they are very different. And while pretty much all of them have three major ethnic slash racial groups in them, like white, which is mainly Spaniard and Portuguese, indigenous American or Amerindian, and black or West slash Central African ancestry, which is what is the main commonality of Latinos and Hispanic people, but the amount are vastly different. There are some places that are overwhelmingly white, there are certain places that are overwhelmingly indigenous, there are places that are overwhelmingly mestizo, which is roughly half white, half indigenous. There are places in Latin America that are mulatto, which is half white, half black, and there is really only one country in Latin America that's overwhelmingly black, which is Haiti, but they are francophone and not Hispanic. So a lot of people don't tend to include Haiti in Latin America, despite it actually fitting in. But due to being francophone and overwhelmingly black, Haitians, especially in the Western world, via United States and Canada, are just seen as black and not Latino. Since I already started with the Caribbean, I might as well talk about the Spanish Caribbean, where there are three countries. The Dominican Republic is a rare case with genetic admixture, since they're about roughly half Spanish European and roughly half black West slash Central African, with very minor indigenous admixture. And you'll notice that in the Spanish Caribbean, there's minor indigenous admixture compared to Central and South America, where there's a lot of indigenous admixture. So pretty much the Dominican Republic, or the people of the Dominican Republic, are akin to black and white biracial or mulatto people in the United States. Cuba and Puerto Rico are pretty similar from what I could tell, as they're roughly around 60 to 70% European white Spaniard, and the others are black and indigenous, and their second biggest genetic component is usually black West African, though it's nowhere near the amount compared to their European admixture. And there's minor Amerindian Taino admixture in both Cuba and Puerto Rico, though there's more in Puerto Rico compared to Cuba, but nowhere near the amount in pretty much any Central or South American country. So Cuba and Puerto Rico are kind of triracial, though they're very white leaning and probably pass for white. And obviously, there's the case with Cuba, where a lot of Cuban Americans who take ancestry tests are generally very, very white, and the ones left on the island are a lot more mixed in comparison. So the genetic admixture of Cuba in general is just pretty controversial overall. Pertaining Central America, it's pretty simple, as this area consists mostly of mestizos, where they on average are half indigenous American and half European Spaniard, with minor African admixture. So countries like Mexico are very mestizo heavy, though there are places like Guatemala and Nicaragua that are most definitely leaning more towards indigenous heavy, and there are places like Costa Rica that are definitely European Spaniard leaning, and Panama's pretty mixed overall. So that's just some of the dynamics with Central America, as they're mainly mestizos, though some are more indigenous leaning mestizos and others are European leaning mestizos. And then when you go to South America, you definitely see a lot more interesting results. So on the Pacific coast, you have indigenous leaning countries like Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador, where they're either indigenous leaning mestizos or they're just overwhelmingly indigenous overall. Though I've heard conflicting reports on that, but in general, this area are the most indigenous heavy in the Americas overall. And then there is the cone, which consists of Uruguay, Paraguay, and Argentina, where they're essentially heavily white, as not only do they have Spaniard European, but they also have other immigration like Italians, which is a heavy presence there, and they even took in some German people who fought in the Second World War. So those countries are heavily European and white. Brazil is definitely a mixed bag, since there are places that are heavily European and there are places that are heavily mulatto as well. But because this is, I believe, the highest populated place in South America, or in the Americas in general, you're just going to have a very large population. And then there are places like Colombia and Venezuela that are kind of mestizo but are also European leaning, though nowhere near as close as places like the Cone. So you have a lot of variety there. French Guiana is a very interesting case, not only because it's a francophone country, hence still being part of Latin America, but its genetic makeup is very interesting. From what I see of the genetic makeup and the demographics of the population, the biggest population or the biggest ethnic group in French Guiana are mulattoes. But if you look at the genetic makeup, you see that they are mixed with African, European, and South Asian, which makes sense because Guyana, which is an Anglophone country, also has a lot of South Asian people, so they have that interesting Creole genetic makeup. And now it is time to look at the principal component analysis chart, which is what the PCA plot chart stands for, which is what I've used during the other parts of the video where I mentioned PCA plots for the other groups. With Hispanics and Latinos, there is a wide range where some of them are more leaning towards the European African linear line, and a lot of others are going more towards the European slash indigenous native linear line. But when you look at most of these plot charts, Most of them are very close to European on average. Obviously, there's some that is in the middle between native and European, and those are the mestizos. And there are some that are leaning towards the African end, or on that line path, but on average, they're still closer to the European than African. Though the ones in the middle are the mulattoes, and those would mainly be the Dominicans or the mulatto Cubans and Puerto Ricans, since the Spanish Caribbeans have more African than native, so they would be on that linear path. And of course, for the mestizos, that's where you have most of the Central Americans, the Mexicans, and the ones that are leaning closer towards the indigenous than anything, those are the Peruvians and the Bolivians. And everyone else that is closer to the white on either end, that is where a lot of the Hispanics are. So, as you can see, they are a wide ranging group of people, though they're more European leaning than anything else on average. And that concludes my opinion on the growing identity of brownness and brown people. I do get where it is coming from because they don't feel white and they don't feel like they are black or even Asian or in the sense of East Asian or Southeast Asian or even Amerindian. So they want their own identity. But the thing is, some of the brown people could be, are, and were considered white in the not too distant past, some still do in the present, and you can't tell the difference between some of them. And the biggest issue is that you're grouping a bunch of people with different ethnicities that have nothing to do with one another, don't even have a history with one another, have different cultures, religions, so on and so forth. So just grouping all of them into one is just very faulty. Ultimately, I do think there needs to be more of a focus on ethnicity than race in anything, since I do believe ethnicity is the most accurate grouping, though I do think race still has an importance, especially based on phenotype. So, I believe, since I talk about reality TV a lot on my channel, that brown representation will not only grow more in the 2020s, but I believe it'll be very prominent in mainstream media overall. And you definitely see that in the casting process for a lot of the reality shows taking place now. And it's even growing in politics. So, thank you all for watching, if anyone even cared about this topic, and I'll definitely be back with other stuff soon. I just needed to get this off my chest. Bye!